The conference room smelled like money and nerves, that sterile combination of polished wood, designer suits, and tension you could slice with a scalpel. I'd been preparing for this moment for 6 months. My entire department's future depended on this pitch. I had just finished explaining the projected ROI when I noticed the subtle shift in the room. A faint smirk on the CEO's face, the kind people wear when they already know something you don't. I kept my tone calm. As you can see, if we launch by the 3rd quarter, we'll capture the market gap before... Let's stop there. A voice interrupted from the corner. It was Ava, the CEO's daughter, the self-proclaimed visionary who'd joined the company 3 months ago after returning from a European MBA program. Her posture screamed confidence. Her voice dripped entitlement. "Cancel this," she said casually, brushing an invisible thread from her silk blazer. "We're funding my concept instead." The room went silent. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. Then the CEO, her father, laughed softly. "Well, I suppose that's one way to do it. Let's hear from Ava." The investors chuckled, as if this was a show they'd all been waiting for. I stood there frozen. My presentation, months of data, research, and sleepless nights, glowing uselessly on the screen behind me. Ava strutted to the front, plugged in her tablet, and with a few taps replaced my slides with hers. "Jessica's proposal was solid," she began, throwing me a sugar-coated dagger of a smile. "But my idea is future-facing. It leverages influencer-driven engagement and sustainability trends, things our brand desperately needs." I watched as my numbers, my graphs, even fragments of my phrasing appeared in her deck. Slightly rearranged, reworded, but unmistakably mine. No one said a word. Not one person in that boardroom looked surprised. The CEO leaned back, pride glowing in his eyes. "This is what leadership looks like," he said, clapping first. The others followed, polite, mechanical applause that sounded like nails in a coffin. My coffin. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, but my face didn't move. I'd learned long ago that silence unnerves powerful people more than anger. So when the clapping died down, I simply said, "Perfect. Enjoy it." Then I disconnected my laptop, placed the clicker on the table, and walked out. No one tried to stop me. The corridor outside the boardroom felt colder than I remembered. My reflection in the glass walls looked calm, almost composed. Not like someone whose career had just been erased by nepotism. I made it to the elevator before my hands started shaking. As the doors closed, I whispered to myself, "Not again." That phrase, "not again," carried 3 years of memories, of being passed over, of ideas stolen and renamed, of quiet smiles masking corporate theft. I'd been here before. But this time I was ready. When I reached my car, I sat in silence for several minutes, the adrenaline draining from my body. Then I pulled out my phone and opened a folder labeled Vault. Inside were every version of my designs, timestamps, patent filings, and proof of authorship. Things I'd been documenting carefully since the first time someone borrowed my work. Let them have the meeting. Let them have their applause. Because what they didn't realize was that the core architecture of my project, the code and the proprietary model behind it, couldn't be replicated without my encryption key. I drove home, each red light feeling like a checkpoint between my old life and the new one forming in my head. When I finally parked, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I opened my laptop. Within an hour, I had already transferred the license of my original prototype to a private shell company I'd registered under my own name months earlier. It was a precaution I never thought I'd need, until now. By the time the sun began to set, my resignation letter sat drafted in my inbox. But I didn't send it yet. Not yet. Because experience had taught me one thing. When people betray you, don't react immediately. Wait. Watch. Let them reveal what they've stolen, and how deep their arrogance runs. 3 hours later, as I poured myself a glass of wine, my phone began buzzing. One call, then another, then another. 48 missed calls, all from the CFO. I set the glass down, my pulse steady. Something had gone very wrong, and they'd just realized what I already knew. The first domino had fallen. The sound of my phone vibrating on the counter felt almost aggressive in the quiet of my apartment. I stared at the glowing screen. 48 missed calls, all from one number. The CFO, Mark Dyer. Mark wasn't the kind of man who called anyone 48 times. He was calm, controlled, the sort of executive who measured his words and always seemed 5 steps ahead. If he was calling me this frantically, something inside the company had gone very wrong. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the callback button. Part of me wanted to let them panic a little longer, but curiosity, and maybe a tiny bit of revenge-fueled satisfaction, won out. When I finally answered, his voice came through ragged and strained. "Jessica, thank God. Where are you?" "At home," I said evenly. "Enjoying my evening, apparently unlike you." "This isn't funny," he snapped. "What did you do?" I leaned back in my chair. "What makes you think I did anything?" "Because," he said, lowering his voice, "the system crashed. The prototype Ava presented, it won't run. Every simulation failed. The investors are furious. Ellis is shouting at everyone, and Ava's in tears." For a second, I let the silence stretch. Then, softly, "Maybe the system doesn't respond well to plagiarism." "Jessica," Mark hissed, "this is serious. The server can't access the neural model files. Everything's locked behind some kind of encryption key." "Was that you?" I took a sip of my wine. "Mark, if you're asking whether I protected my intellectual property before someone stole it, yes, I did. Everything that belongs to the company is still there. But what they presented today, that was mine. And mine is protected." He exhaled sharply. "Jessica, listen. Ellis is furious, but he's also scared. The investors are threatening to pull funding. I'm not saying I agree with how this was handled, but if you come in tomorrow, maybe we can..." "Maybe we can what?" I interrupted. "Pretend none of it happened? Pretend his daughter didn't humiliate me in front of the entire board?" "Look, I'll be honest," Mark said, his tone softening. "I told Ellis it was a mistake. Ava's concept was never viable without your base framework. They thought they could plug in your files and make it work. But it turns out your security protocols are, well, bulletproof." I allowed myself the smallest smile. "Good to know." He sighed. "I'm on your side, Jess. But if you don't show up tomorrow, they'll blame you for everything. They're already drafting an internal memo accusing you of sabotage." That caught my attention. "Sabotage?" He hesitated. "You know how corporate works. They'll shift blame before they admit incompetence." I hung up a few minutes later with no promises made. Then I sat in the dim light of my apartment, trying to decide what to do next. The next morning, I woke to a dozen new messages. Half were from coworkers, whispers of chaos spreading through the office. The other half were from numbers I didn't recognize. Probably reporters. Word always leaked faster than truth. By 8 a.m., I was standing outside the glass tower that had once felt like my dream. The company logo gleamed proudly on the building, but inside I could already see panic. People rushing between meeting rooms, phones pressed to ears, security standing awkwardly in the lobby. As I walked in, the receptionist looked up, startled. "Jessica, I thought..." "I know," I said quietly, "but I need to see Mr. Dyer." Mark met me in the lobby 10 minutes later. He looked exhausted, shirt wrinkled, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. "You shouldn't have come," he muttered. "Ellis is on a warpath." "Then let's not keep him waiting," I said. We rode the elevator in silence. The tension in the building was palpable, the kind that spreads when people sense the walls are cracking. When we reached the executive floor, voices echoed down the hall. Ellis was yelling. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" He barked. "The board's threatening an emergency review, and Kellen Ventures has frozen the funding until we provide results." Ava sat in the corner, mascara streaked down her cheeks, her usual arrogance replaced by fear. When Ellis saw me, his face twisted. "You. I hope you came to explain why my company is on fire?" I didn't flinch. "Your company's on fire because you handed a match to your daughter." "Don't get clever," he snapped. "Unlock the files." I folded my arms. Those files are encrypted because they contain intellectual property registered under my name. You presented my work without consent. I'm not breaking my own legal protection. Ava stood abruptly. "You can't do this. We're family here, family," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "You humiliated me in front of my peers, took my research and claimed it was yours. That's not family, that's theft." Ellis slammed his fist on the table. "Enough. You think you can hold us hostage? I'll have my lawyers." "Go ahead," I said. "They'll love discovering the timestamps that prove every element of that project originated on my personal account. The one I legally backed up and patented 6 months ago." Mark's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't known that. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ellis's tone shifted. Quieter, but more dangerous. "You're making a mistake, Jessica. You can't win against us." I met his stare. "Then maybe it's time you learned what happens when people like you underestimate the ones who built your empire." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out. My heart was pounding, but my steps were steady. In the elevator, I checked my phone again. Another message from Mark flashed across the screen. "The investors want to meet you." Privately. Noon. "Don't tell Ellis," I exhaled slowly, staring at my reflection in the mirrored wall. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the employee they could silence. I felt like the one writing the next chapter. The cafe across the street from headquarters had always been my quiet escape. A place where I could think clearly, away from the politics upstairs. But today, as I stepped inside, it felt more like neutral ground for a war negotiation. 3 of the company's investors were already seated in the back corner, their tailored suits and tense expressions making them impossible to miss. Mark was with them, and when he spotted me, he gave a subtle nod. Part relief, part warning. "Jessica," said the man in the middle, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Hale. You probably know who I am, I did. He wasn't just an investor. He was the majority stakeholder, the one person Ellis truly feared." "Please sit," Richard said. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "We need clarity." Quickly, I took a seat across from them, folding my hands on the table. "I assume this is about the situation." Mark exhaled through his nose. "That's one way to describe it. The company's lost access to every prototype file. The presentation Ava gave is falling apart. Investors are demanding answers." I looked at Richard. "And what answers has Ellis given you so far?" Richard's expression hardened. "That you sabotaged the system and withheld critical data." I almost laughed. "Of course he did." He leaned forward. "Did you?" "No," I said simply. "I protected my work." "There's a difference. Every file that belongs to the company is still there, but the algorithm Ava tried to present wasn't theirs to begin with." Mark spoke carefully. "Jessica, you understand how this looks from the outside. You walked out mid-meeting, the system failed hours later, and now Ellis is claiming you locked everything behind personal encryption." "That encryption," I said evenly, "was registered with our legal department months ago as part of my data protection protocol. Ellis approved it himself. That made them pause." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You're saying Ellis signed off on the same system that's now preventing him from accessing your research?" "Exactly." Mark frowned. "But the investors saw working results before Ava's presentation. How's that possible if the system was locked?" I looked at him. "Because those demonstrations ran through my access key. Once I resigned from the network, those authorizations expired automatically. Nothing malicious. Just standard cybersecurity procedure." Richard sat back, processing. "So this collapse wasn't sabotage. It was consequence. Precisely. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Richard asked, "Do you still have functional copies of your model?" "Yes," I said. "Privately stored. Independently tested and legally registered under my own name." Mark gave me a sharp look. "You filed ownership independently?" I nodded. After the first time one of my concepts got rebranded without credit, I decided to protect myself. Every design iteration since then has been logged and notarized. Ellis knew, but he didn't care. He assumed my loyalty would outweigh my self-preservation. Richard let out a low, humorless chuckle. Classic Ellis. Overconfidence wrapped in arrogance. He leaned forward again. "Tell me something, Jessica. If you still control the working prototype, would you consider presenting it to us directly?" Off the record, that caught me off guard. "You mean, without the company?" "Correct," he said. "We're not interested in drama. We're interested in results." Mark looked uneasy. "Richard, are you sure that's—" "I'm sure," Richard interrupted. "Ellis is spiraling. His daughter's meltdown yesterday was a PR disaster, and the board is already whispering about his removal. If Jessica's data can be verified, we may have a path forward that doesn't involve him." I hesitated. It was one thing to defend myself, another to expose the company's failures. But I thought of that moment in the boardroom, the laughter, the dismissal, the look on Ava's face when she erased 3 years of my work with one sentence. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll show you." Richard nodded once. "Good. Bring your documentation and the functional demo. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., my private office downtown. No company representatives. Just us." Mark's jaw tightened. "Ellis is going to lose it when he finds out." Richard smirked. "Then don't tell him until it's over." After the meeting, I sat alone in my car for a long time, the city noise muffled behind the glass. The logical part of me knew what this was, an opportunity to reclaim control. But another part of me, the part that still cared, felt something like grief. I had given that company everything, my ideas, my time, my loyalty, and they'd traded it for nepotism. That night, I barely slept. I went through every file, every lab note, every timestamp I'd ever saved. By 2 a.m., my small apartment looked like a command center. Folders spread across the table, laptop screens glowing with proof of everything I'd built. At 2:47 a.m., an email arrived from a blocked address. Subject: "You think you've won?" Body: "You're playing with fire, Jessica. Don't forget who built your career." I stared at it for a full minute, then deleted it without replying. Because he was wrong. He hadn't built my career. I had. And tomorrow morning, I would prove it. Morning light filtered through my blinds like an interrogation lamp. I'd barely slept, but adrenaline had taken the place of rest. Today wasn't just about defending myself. It was about reclaiming what they'd tried to take. By 8:30 a.m., I stood outside Richard Hale's private office on the 27th floor of a downtown high-rise. The space was nothing like Ellis's, less showy, more deliberate. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with titles on economics, leadership, and a few personal photos of family. It looked like the office of a man who built empires quietly. A young assistant showed me in. Richard was already there, joined by 2 other investors, Amira Patel and Daniel Cho, faces I recognized from board meetings but who had never spoken directly to me. They greeted me politely, though I could sense skepticism beneath their professionalism. "Good morning, Jessica," Richard said, gesturing toward the conference table. "We appreciate you coming." "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied. He nodded at my briefcase. "You brought the documentation?" I set it down, carefully arranging the stack of folders, flash drives, and legal certifications I'd assembled overnight. "Everything you'll need to verify the research, timestamps, and patent registrations. All verified by independent counsel," Amira leaned forward. "And the live demo?" I took a slow breath. "Ready." I opened my laptop and connected it to the monitor on the wall. The familiar interface came to life. The one I'd designed, tested, refined through thousands of hours of trial and error. Seeing it again felt both empowering and painful. This, I began, is the adaptive delivery framework that underpinned my project. The version Ava attempted to present yesterday was an incomplete copy. It lacked the authentication algorithm that stabilizes performance under real-time conditions. Daniel frowned slightly. Meaning? Meaning, I said. Without it, the system collapses. The data looks fine on paper, but it fails in practice. That's what you saw happen yesterday. I clicked a few keys and the model began running. Real-time metrics appeared on the screen. Stability at 99.8%, performance threshold green. Perfect. The investors leaned forward, watching as I walked them through the process. The equations, the testing environment, the verification logs. Every data point matched the reports they'd seen months earlier, except now, the results were replicable. Richard's eyes narrowed in concentration. This is the same model that generated those early results? Yes, I said. Except now it's mine, not theirs. And it works because it was built from understanding, not imitation. Amira glanced at Richard, then back at me. Ellis told us you developed this while employed under his company. That gives them partial ownership under your contract, I expected that. Only for work conducted during paid hours using company resources, I replied. But the core algorithm, the stabilizer and authentication framework, were developed independently, on my own equipment, in my own time. I've got digital evidence for every stage. I handed her a folder, showing notarized timestamps and independent lab correspondence. I anticipated what might happen after seeing how they handled previous innovations, so I made sure to protect my work legally. Daniel whistled softly. You were smart. Cautious, I corrected. Smart would have been leaving sooner. Richard gave a small, approving smile. I appreciate your transparency. Tell me, Jessica, what do you want now? The question caught me off guard. What do I want? Yes, he said. If we back you, what's your goal? To take Ellis down? To build something of your own? Or just to be right? I paused. The truth was, a week ago I would have said revenge. But now, sitting here, watching the data flow across the screen, proof that my work could change the industry, I realized it wasn't about revenge at all. I want to continue the work, I said finally. Properly, ethically, with people who care about innovation, not power. Amira nodded slowly. And if we agree to that, what happens to Ellis's company? That's up to them, I said. But without this technology, they'll lose every investor who matters. I'm not sabotaging them. I'm just moving forward without them. Silence filled the room. Then Richard leaned back, exhaling. I'll be blunt, Jessica. What you've done here is extraordinary, but it puts us in a complicated position. If we support you, we'll be burning bridges with Ellis and possibly facing legal backlash. I met his gaze. Then you'll need to decide what's more valuable, loyalty to a crumbling empire or investment in something that works. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he stood. We'll verify your documents. If everything checks out, expect to hear from us within 48 hours. He extended his hand. I shook it firmly, keeping my composure even as adrenaline surged through me. As I packed up my laptop, Amira offered a small smile. You handled yourself well in there. Ellis underestimated the wrong person. When I stepped back into the hallway, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. Ellis just found out you met with the investors. He's losing it. Be careful, Jess. I slipped my phone into my bag, a quiet calm settling over me. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what Ellis might do next, because panic only works when the other person still has power. And this time, he didn't. 2 days passed like a held breath. I went through the motions of normal life. Grocery shopping, feeding my cat, answering meaningless emails. But underneath it all, I was waiting. Every sound from my phone made my heart skip. Every silence stretched too long. By Friday morning, I was pouring coffee when the message finally came. From Richard Hale. Subject, decision body. Everything checks out. We're terminating funding to Ellis's company effective immediately. Let's discuss next steps today at 2 p.m. Just you and me. I read it twice before the weight of it hit me. It was over. The empire that had dismissed me, humiliated me, and stolen my work was collapsing. I got dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel grounded. A navy blazer, no makeup beyond a steadying shade of lipstick. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I hadn't seen in years. A woman in control of her own story. At 2 p.m., Richard's assistant ushered me back into his office. He looked up from his laptop and smiled, faintly this time. "You were right," he said simply. "Your documentation is airtight. Our auditors verified every timestamp, every patent, every experiment log. Ellis doesn't have a case." I exhaled slowly, tension leaving my shoulders. "What about the company?" "Already imploding," Richard replied. "The board held an emergency session this morning. Half the investors pulled out after seeing the data you shared. The rest are demanding Ellis's resignation." I hesitated. "And Ava?" "She resigned last night. There's a rumor she's leaving the country for a while." The image of her smug grin from that day in the boardroom flashed through my mind, but instead of satisfaction, I felt something closer to pity. Maybe she'd finally learned what accountability felt like. Richard's voice pulled me back. "We'd like to invest in you directly, Jessica. A new company, independent with full creative control. We can fund your research under your leadership. Name your terms." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd spent so long fighting for recognition that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be believed in. "I want transparency," I said finally. "No politics. No stolen credit. Everyone who works for me gets proper acknowledgement." Richard nodded. "Done. We'll draft the paperwork this week." I smiled. "Then let's build something real." That evening, I walked along the river, my phone buzzing with notifications, news headlines, industry blogs, whispers of a scandal spreading through the business world. CEO steps down amid intellectual property dispute. Whistleblower scientist proves key innovation was hers. Ellis Group faces collapse after funding withdrawal. I stopped reading after that. The satisfaction was fleeting. I wasn't interested in headlines. What mattered was the quiet that came after. The kind that only arrives once you've stopped trying to prove your worth to people who never intended to see it. Back at my apartment, I found an envelope slipped under the door. No name, no return address. Just my own name written in rushed handwriting. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a USB drive. The note read, "You were always the one who deserved it. I'm sorry. Mark." My chest tightened. The drive contained internal emails, proof that Ellis had planned to claim ownership of my algorithm months before Ava's presentation. I sat down, overwhelmed by how deeply the betrayal had gone, and how quietly Mark must have risked everything to send this. I typed a brief reply from my phone. "Thank you. I hope you find a place that deserves your integrity." Then I deleted the evidence from my mind, if not from my files. There was no need to destroy what was already broken. The next morning, I met Zara, my closest friend from the lab, for coffee. She looked exhausted, but lighter somehow. "You heard, right?" she said. "Ellis was escorted out yesterday. No press, no ceremony. Just gone." "I heard," I said. She stirred her drink. "People are talking about you. Some say you planned it all. Others say you got lucky." "Maybe both," I said with a small smile. She reached across the table. "So what now?" "I'm starting something new. My own lab, my own team." Zara's eyebrows lifted. "You need another scientist?" I laughed. "Always." She grinned. "Then count me in." For the first time in years, I felt something pure. Not anger, not relief, but peace. A week later, I stood inside an empty workspace, bare walls, two desks, and a whiteboard waiting to be filled. The sign on the door read LUMA Biotech, the name I'd chosen. Simple, bright, and nothing like the cold empire I'd left behind. As the lights flickered on, I thought about how far I'd come, from being dismissed in a boardroom to building something of my own. People often think revenge is about destruction, but it's not. True revenge is creation, proving you can rise higher without the ones who tried to bury you. I turned off my phone, set my files on the desk, and opened a clean page in my notebook. At the top, I wrote, Phase 1. Build with integrity. And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Not out of triumph, but out of freedom.